Yes, that's right. This graphics card was released 2 years ago at $200. It's the GTX 1630. Now, it was quickly overlooked because it was a weak card and Nvidia was silently releasing this while everyone else was waiting for the 40 series card. It is important to establish that the GTX 1630 is a low-end card. It's basically the spiritual successor of the GT 1030. However, if you do come across this in the used marketplace in 2024, is this actually worth buying if priced right? Now, I bought ours for about $30 and my expectations were low. Alright, let's run this card in our fast-paced shooters and see who this card is actually for. And to make things interesting, let's throw in AMD's unpopular card, the RX 6500 XT in there as well, because why not? But before that, this video is brought to you by AliExpress, and they're currently running another mega sale for the month of July. You guys know I'm all about value, and one of our recommended budget processors for fast-paced shooter games is the Ryzen 5600. This one's only at $73 at AliExpress, but if you enter the coupon code right here, you'll bring it down to $68. So head down to AliExpress, the links are in the description. Let's get back to the video. The card we're using is the colorful GTX 1630. This one comes with the standard 4GB GDDR6 VRAM, and we're putting this in our Ryzen 5800 X3D system with the latest drivers and Windows version. We're also using a capture card so there's no performance loss during recording. Let's start off with Warzone. Here's how the GTX 1630 runs on native 1080p on competitive settings, and it's pretty bad. That's 43 FPS with around 30 on its 1% lows. Okay, let's throw in some FSR3 upscaling because we cannot use DLSS with the GTX cards, and we seem to have bumped the frames a little bit with FSR quality, but it's still below 60. Let's turn it up a little bit more, and here we have FSR3 performance. We're finally getting more than 60 FPS with lows picking up as well. This is good, very good. Of course, we'll definitely suffer from visibility, but we might as well have bad visibility with faster response rather than normal visibility but unable to frag, right? Okay, let's move on to the main game in Uzbekistan, and this one is definitely not the best experience. Yes, it's a low-end card after all, and as expected, we are GPU bottleneck here. And yes, you can definitely feel the slower frame times. That's 16 milliseconds here. And look at that inconsistency. It's a miracle how I can hit my shots here. It's not ideal, and you will struggle here in Uzbekistan. But hey, at least it's bearable in the gulag. The only good things with the GTX 1630 is the temperature and GPU power. They're pretty low, which is expected from a low-end card. Let's move on to another fast-paced shooter, Apex Legends. This one's another title where you will struggle if you try to play competitively with the GTX 1630. Once again, we are GPU bottleneck, 99% usage on our GTX 1630, and we're getting under 90 FPS here. Frame times is about 14 milliseconds and manageable, but because our raw frames are lower, yes, it's not bad. Even with this optimized game, there's not much we can do because we are on a low-end card. Yes, you can play and you can try to shoot, but this can feel really sluggish and will be a real challenge for you. Our next competitive game is Fortnite, and in this one, let's just go with performance mode because we really don't have much option. And despite that, we're still GPU bound in this game. FPS is not that bad depending on where you are. We should be getting about 160 FPS on busier action scenes and would be higher on scenes where there isn't much happening. Our 1% lows is at 110, which is lower than what we would usually get on our beefier cards. When we are moving around with our car, we also get a lot of frame time spikes, which can be annoying. We're still getting about 65 watts of GPU power here, less than 2 GB of VRAM utilized, and temperature is decent at 55 degrees. And for everyone else who is curious on the other APIs, this is how it would look like for the GTX 1630 on DX11, DX12, and performance mode. don't even bother with the other APIs, okay? Just stick with performance mode on this one, boys, because you wouldn't have any other choice. And before we proceed, boys, if you want to see us testing more of these budget cards, hit that like button and subscribe. Alright, let's move on. Another game which is demanding on our graphics is Helldivers 2. Here's the GTX 1630 at native 1080p low settings, and even at low settings, frame rates are pretty low and we're not yet out there fighting bugs for managed democracy. So let's use our built-in upscaler, and we managed to drill it down to balance to push it further. We are still GPU bottleneck here, but now you can see that huge leap in FPS from the native 1080p. Not the best upscaling tech, but hey, let's work with what we have. Now, let's go test this out in our typical Terminid infested planet scenario. And as always, we are on Helldive difficulty because we're Helldivers, right? The first thing you'll notice in here is that our FPS, as expected, drop when we're swarmed with a lot of bugs. We're getting less than 60 now with lows at around 50 because there's a lot of things going on. Frame times is not that bad. This is functional. However, there is another thing more concerning here. In a foggy environment, visibility would be affected in any game, right? But in our experience, it is much worse and very limited, and this is because of our upscaling settings. I was mainly relying on the spear to take down the titans that I can't see. Long-range visibility in here is non-existent. Fire effects can be pixelated, but we are still able to exterminate bugs. Yes, you can play Helldivers 2 on this card. Make sure you paired it with at least a decent CPU like the Ryzen 5600, which we mentioned earlier, and you'll be happy. Also, try to avoid weapons which are for long range and you'll be fine. Okay, let's go back to our competitive games, and next up is Valorant. This one doesn't require a lot of GPU resource, but even so, we still managed to max out our GTX 1630. Even with a decent processor like the Ryzen 5800X3D, we are not able to push our FPS any higher. We're getting about 200 or sometimes 300 FPS depending on the scene. It's definitely not the best, but it is okay. Even with a lot of effects, we're still getting a decent gaming experience. 55 watts on the power, and it's pretty cool at sub 50 degrees temperature. Moving on to another game which demands more GPU resource is PUBG. Here we have the GTX 1630 once again maxed out on utilization, and our FPS here is a bit low. Yes, you can get 60 FPS, but this is not very snappy. The response is just not there, and this is why it's difficult to hit with your shots here, like 17 milliseconds on the frame times. Definitely hard to play this game unless if you go for a more passive play style. The power is kicking up here, going over 60 watts. VRAM is close to 3 gigabytes with really good temperatures. Now that we've done all our gameplays, let's see how the GTX 1630 compares against our RX 6500 XT. When looking at their brand new price, they're really close to each other, hence why we're comparing them. Okay, let's start with our heavier games, and here's Warzone. At FSR 3 quality, there is no contest here. Look at the huge lead of the RX 6500 XT. That's almost triple. Despite its flaws, RX 6500 XT is just able to push more frames here, obviously consuming more power, but I'm willing to trade about 20 watts of power if it means that I'm able to push more frames. Even though they have the same bus width, the superior bandwidth of the RX 6500 XT is able to widen that gap. In Helldivers 2, this isn't as bad as our Warzone experience, but the GTX 1630 is still struggling here against the RX 6500 XT. Both are GPU bottleneck, and the RX 6500 XT is once again smashing the GTX 1630 on its knees, regardless on our running, firing benchmark, or in our stratagem testing. So there's definitely no contest on this one. In PUBG, it's the same story. Running benchmark is around more than double. Like, look at the difference in frame times. You've got 7 milliseconds on one against about 15 milliseconds on the other. On the heavier action scenes, you get the RX 6500 XT continues to plow through and actually has better stability over the Nvidia card. Going down to our less demanding titles, Fortnite follows the same trend. In performance mode, the RX 6500 XT maintains that lead, not as high as the previous game, but still high enough. The GTX 1630 is maxed out here, while the RX 6500 XT isn't always maxed out. It's why it's able to utilize more of our CPU and push more frames. I'd like to comment here that AMD's drivers seem to be working well for performance mode. No clock speed drops here on our RX 6500 XT, which is really good to see. In Valorant, once again, we have a huge lead for the RX 6500 XT, regardless if it is the running benchmark or heavy action scenes. Although it isn't like double the FPS, it is still a favorable lead for the RX 6500 XT. The GTX 1630 stands no chance against its AMD competitor if we're talking about price head-to-head. And I know some people might say, the flaws of the RX 6500 XT, like no encoder, limited output, etc. But I would still take that card over the GTX 1630, and that's because of the raster performance. So what's the GTX 1630 good for? Well, this one's good if you find a used card at a bargain price and you just want to play lighter games. But if you're buying this new, just don't. Literally don't even think about it. There are plenty of choices out there in the new and the used markets. One particular card you might consider is the RX 5700 XT. That card's about 5 years old now, but it's still very capable. We actually did a video about that just recently, so if you want to see how that gun goes, click this video right here and I'll see you over there.